A group of Texas lawmakers filed a bill on Thursday that would expand access to state misconduct records.
This all comes after a KXAN investigative series uncovered a former juvenile corrections officer was able to work inside a Central Texas high school, all while under investigation for sexual misconduct by a state agency.
Y'all were one of the stories that were reported that shows that there's a gap in the system. And because of the reporting that you had, it makes it even more clear that we have to plug that gap. So that's why this bill exists.
The investigative reporter here at KXAN behind all of this is reporter Kelly Wiley, and she also found some blind spots and delays across state do not hire registries, and is of course joining us here live in studio. Kelly, remind us about this story that sparked this legislation and what you found.
Well, what we found was a perfect example of several gaps in our system. We learned back in December 2023, we learned about a tutor at an Austin high school who was arrested for felony indecency with a child. But we realized that this person had also worked as a juvenile corrections officer and was investigated for sexual misconduct by the Texas Juvenile Justice Department over his time there. The agency actually found that he did have an inappropriate relationship with a youth. He's facing charges in Travis County and Lee County. Our question was, how did he end up working at a school given that investigation? And what we found was, again, a perfect example of several gaps in how state misconduct information is shared. One, Smith was not hired by Austin ISD. He was hired by a third-party nonprofit to tutor. And the database that TJJD would have put their data on misconduct into related to Smith, it wasn't accessible to this nonprofit. They could call and they could ask TJJD about a prospective hire, but they would have to have a reason to call. Think about a resume. You're listing out where you've been, and that's what maybe prompts the person to make that call. But the second part of this is there currently is no functional and centralized database with state misconduct records. They exist in separate databases, but again, they're not connected. Think TEA has one, TJJD has one, but they're not really talking to one another.
Regarding all of that, though, there are some ways that they're trying to correct this, right?
Absolutely. They passed in the last legislature a law that would create a centralized database. So all those different ones for different agencies we just talked about, they're trying to combine it. But what do we know about when these bills get passed, how long it can sometimes take to come to fruition? So all these agencies have been working on that, but it's not in use right now. So we know about a gap that exists, but the solution is still on its way. This bill would make sure that when that database is complete, that third-party contractors who have staff that go into schools, have staff that go around vulnerable populations, like in this case where there was a nonprofit that would put tutors into schools, that they also have access to this state misconduct data when they're making their hiring decisions. So that's what this bill would do.
We've been tightening down these background checks for teachers and administrators, et cetera. There's been issues where contractors that have a really negative criminal background, maybe even pedophilia or whatever else, have been able to get on access to schools. So we're trying to put an absolute halt to that. So that's what this bill is about.
Really the definition of a loophole that you shined a light on with your investigation and now this resulting legislation. But what else are the senators or other lawmakers looking to do to really attack this all-encompassing issue?
So for this investigative series, we talked to Senator Betancourt and also Senator Colcourse, who I know you've talked to also about similar things, about these sometimes gaps in backgrounding. And they've both described it as kind of playing whack-a-mole. Every year in the legislature, we do these stories that come out about some sort of loophole and they're trying to fill it. And so one of the things that came up in our reporting, TEA actually said this in a letter to Betancourt when he asked about how did this happen with this tutor? They said, we don't have the authority to make a school district report contractors who are accused of misconduct. We can't make them report it. And even if they did, we don't have the authority to investigate it and add it to our do not hire registry. So that's one thing I know that they're looking at. Also, when we talked about building this database, what else do we know about things when these laws are passed? It takes money sometimes. So one thing we heard from some of the agencies is that they need more resources to make sure that this is on the right track, to make sure that it's in use.
all things we know you'll be following this upcoming legislative session when it kicks off in January. So Kelly, thank you so much for coming on to break it all down for us.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, you can find her full original story in the investigative section of KXAN.com.